Hello, and welcome to Astronomy 100. In this first series of videos, we're going to begin the semester by describing how we organize the sky. Astronomy as a subject, of course, is one that covers exploration of the entire universe, but a big part of astronomy has to do with how we see things in the sky. And so the ability to see things in the sky and to be able to study them in an organized fashion is an important idea. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the key concepts in this portion is to describe some of the very fundamentals of how we organize the sky. For instance, over here on the right, this is just a photograph of the sky, or a portion of the sky. And you can see that there are lots of stars in the sky, many things that you can see with your own eyes. Another example, of course, is the moon is something you see quite a bit. You can see it with your own eyes. And from time to time, there are planets that you could see with your own eyes. This is the planet Venus. And occasionally, we get visits by comets, and you can go outside and again, see these things with your own eyes. But the problem is that in astronomy, in our universe, there are many, many objects that you just cannot see with your eyes. They are invisible to our naked eye, and they require the ability to find them using telescopes. And so what we will eventually get to is how do we find objects that are invisible to the naked eye? So there are many objects that we see. These are just a few. But we also need to talk about how we name the stars themselves. And so we'll go into the details of how that works. So let's go ahead and get started with describing the organization of the sky. Now, it turns out the sky has a way to organize itself, and we're going to take advantage of just human nature. For instance, when you look at this picture here, you'll notice that there are lots of faint stars, and there are some noticeably bright stars. And it's almost a habit that we have that we recognize patterns in the sky. Pattern recognition is part of human nature. It's something that we've evolved to do. We can't help ourselves. So whenever we look at random things, such as stars, it's very normal for us to recognize patterns. For instance, you might have almost immediately been drawn to these three stars that look like they're almost perfectly in a row. And in nature, something that has a pattern, such as this line of stars, will get your attention. So when we look at the random stars of the sky, even though those stars are truly random, we do the thing that we're good at, and that is we look at patterns and we find patterns. So let me expand out a little bit. Here is a portion of the sky, and each of these dots represents an actual star. And what you can see is that just by looking at the randomness of the stars, there are patterns that jump out at us. Notice these stars down here make a pattern, and you can see right here that these stars here make a particular pattern. Here's a group of stars that makes a pattern. And so it's very normal for us to see these patterns, even though, again, they're just random stars. Now, it's something that we actually do quite often. We do this with the surface of the Earth, and we can use patterns to organize things. An example is that if you want to refer to this particular pattern of stars as this portion of the sky represented by this pattern, then that part of the sky has been organized into just one region that is signified by this pattern. If we go to the surface of the Earth, it's actually quite the same. Here is a photograph of the surface of the Earth. And we learn to recognize patterns to organize the Earth. You can find North America and South America based on their shape. And so if I were to say something on Earth is located in North America, then it is the pattern or the shape of North America that allows you to find that part of the Earth. You would never look over here if you are trying to find something in North America. So shapes, these random shapes, create patterns, and of course these patterns can be used to organize. So in astronomy, what we do is we take advantage of these patterns, and we take it a few steps further. For instance, let's go back to the same group of stars that we started with. And if you use your imagination, let's say we start to connect the stars together into a particular pattern that we seem to recognize or seem to put into the stars. We might put a shaped like this. So these are the same stars, but connected in a particular way that might make it look reminiscent of something that's familiar. And so when we do this, we have now created a pattern from these stars. And if we can simply locate this pattern in the sky, we have now found that region of the sky based on that pattern. Now, in ancient times, the people of the earth took this one step further because these patterns were meaningful to them. And so they would often tell stories about these patterns to explain the patterns. And it was one way for them to carry on the mythology of the day, the history of the day, and just simply tell stories because they didn't have televisions or they didn't have a way to write things down. So they used to verbally tell stories. And the patterns in the sky were the way that they would use to accompany the stories that they would tell. For instance, this pattern that you see here, if you imagine that this is a person, you might think this is a set of shoulders down here. He might have a belt going around his waist, his legs come down, an arm sticking out. You might imagine that this is some sort of a shield of some sort. Maybe he's holding a sword above his head. His head would be here. And then you would, of course, imagine that this would be a person. And so this group of stars is called Orion. And Orion was an imaginary hunter or soldier. And it is just an illusion of the stars that makes the pattern. But it's human nature to put a particular story to that pattern. So now, if I were to say a particular object is located in the sky in Orion, then of course what you would do is you would go outside and you would simply look for this pattern. And once you find that pattern, you have found Orion, and then you can find the object that you're looking for that's located in Orion. So the patterns of the stars become very useful. And that brings us to our first definition. And the definition is the word constellation. A constellation, by definition, is just simply a pattern of stars that's named after something. And in historical times, the names that were given to these patterns were often related to what we call the mythology of the day. So they were either mythological animals, they were characters from mythology, or they were everyday objects. And I have a few examples for you here. This is the pattern that you would find in the sky that is associated with the story of Andromeda. So there is a constellation called Andromeda. Another pattern over here, this is the pattern that goes with the story of the character named Perseus. Perseus was somebody who was a bit of a hero. In the story of Perseus, he slays the witch Medusa. So he's holding the head of Medusa here. And he's actually the hero that saves Andromeda. So it's a story, but the stars themselves make up a pattern that is given the name Perseus, the constellation Perseus. Here is Sagittarius. The reason why I show this one is it's a good example of a mythological animal or character, half man, half horse, not something that truly existed, but of course in our imaginations we could make up such a thing and tell stories about it. So Sagittarius, the archer, is also a constellation in the sky. Now, sometimes the constellations are just everyday objects. There is a constellation out in the summertime that is called Lyra, and Lyra is named after a musical instrument called a lyre. It's spelled L-Y-R-E, and it's really the ancestor to the modern day harp. So Lyra the lyre is an example of a constellation just named after an everyday object. So these patterns that we find in the sky, they really have no physical significance. In other words, just because we call it Sagittarius the centaur, the half man, half horse, doesn't mean that the stars themselves have any significance to this mythical creature. It's just what we in our imagination project into the sky. So there's just nothing about the stars themselves that have anything to do with life here on Earth. This is just all something that we do in our imagination. Now, when it comes to the constellations, though, there are a few issues that have to go with it. For instance, one of the problems that we have is the constellations of the Earth are ones that are named by the cultures that are seeing the stars themselves. So various cultures around the Earth will look up in the sky and they will see various characters. And many of these characters that they see are characters from whatever storytelling that they would do. But you can imagine that the cultures around the Earth are going to have their own versions of the different stories that they tell. So an example is that the Native Americans would look up in the sky and they would see patterns that are based on what was important to them, maybe the animals that they see in the world around them. But the people who live in a different part of the world, let's say you live in a part of the world where there are no bears, or a part of the world where your animals are very different, So one of the problems that had to be addressed historically is, what do we do when you have many different cultures all looking at the same stars, but they see different patterns of those same stars? And so we can't simply have constellations that have many different names for the same patterns. So back in the early part of the 20th century, there was a remedy, something that was done to fix this problem. And what was done was to adopt a certain set of patterns that all people on Earth, all astronomers on Earth, will abide by. And so there were 88 constellations that were officially recognized. And the organization in charge of this is called the International Astronomical Union. Sometimes you see it abbreviated as IAU. And these 88 constellations are the ones that we now officially use. The problem, though, is the heritage of the constellations is one that was really ignored by the IAU when it comes to some cultures. The 88 constellation patterns that we adopted and we still use today are mostly Greek and Roman mythology. There are no constellations that have any Chinese heritage, let's say, or there are no constellations that have Native American heritage. It was because of the era, the early 20th century, and because a lot of the science of astronomy comes from Europe, that it was chosen that the Greek and the Roman mythological characters would end up being the names of those constellations. So there are 88 constellation patterns that are officially recognized today. Now, what sort of changed as well is that in the era of exploration, when Magellan started to sail to various places in the southern hemisphere, there were new sets of stars that were seen. And so new constellations had to be added to the ones that you can only see from the northern hemisphere. So some of the constellation patterns that we name today are very modern. They're not thousands of years old because they were added in the 16th and 17th centuries when we started to see these new patterns of stars. So the constellations, these 88 constellations, are a mixture of very ancient names and very ancient patterns, as well as fairly modern patterns. An example is there is a constellation called Microscopium. Now, obviously, it's named after the microscope, and so it is obviously something fairly modern. There were no microscopes back in the time of the ancient Greeks. So it is just a mixture of history. It's a mixture of ideas. It's animals, it's people, it's mythological characters. And to be perfectly honest, it's just a matter of whatever we happen to imagine we see in the sky. There is no right or wrong, but we do have to adopt one set of constellations to be able to talk about them in a common language. And so the names from the Greek and Roman mythology are the ones that stick today. So the constellation patterns, the idea goes back many thousands of years, but it's still something that we use today. Even though we don't care about the mythology, today we still want to be able to say a particular object is located in Andromeda, and that way you can look for Andromeda and find that object. So constellations only serve the purpose today of being real navigational tools to be able to isolate parts of the sky. Now, we're going to see that there are some other issues that have to be addressed that had to be included in this that are related to the constellations. And of course, one of the things has to do with how we create maps of the sky. But we're starting to get a little short on time for this video. We'll save that for the next one. I hope you'll join me.